Knew something was wrong the moment he laughed too quickly. It wasn't a real laugh. It was the kind that fills space. The kind a man uses when he wants you to feel comfortable while he's busy calculating something. My daughter had brought him home for Sunday dinner, third time in 2 months, and he sat at my kitchen table with that wide, easy smile and asked me how long I'd owned the house. Not what a beautiful home. Not I love what you've done with the garden. He asked how long I'd owned it. I told him 26 years. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're filing something away. My daughter. I'll call her my girl because that's what she'll always be. She was 33 then, and she had the kind of heart that made her believe the best in everyone. She got that from her father. He passed 7 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. After he was gone, it was just the two of us, and we grew even closer than we'd been before. She'd drive up from the city most weekends. We'd sit on the back porch with coffee and watch the mist come off the lake. Yes, there's a lake. The back of my property borders it. 1/2 an acre of frontage, a small dock my husband built the summer before our youngest started kindergarten. When the light hits it in the early morning, it looks like hammered silver. I never take it for granted, not a single day. The house is paid off. I have investments, modest but solid. My husband was careful that way, and I learned from him. I spent 31 years as a school librarian, which is not a profession that makes you rich, but it makes you observant. You learn to read people the way you read books. You notice what they emphasize, what they skip over, what they come back to. He came back to the property twice more that evening. Once, when my girl was in the kitchen refilling the bread basket, he leaned forward and said very casually, "So is this all one parcel, or did you ever subdivide?" And once at the end of the night, standing in the driveway saying goodbye, he looked out toward the back and said, "That lake access must be worth something, huh?" I smiled both times. I said something pleasant and non-committal, but I watched him. His name was Garrett. No, wait, I need to stop. Naming him gives him more than he deserves. I'll call him what he was, the fiancé. My girl had met him through a mutual friend at a birthday party in the city. He was charming and exactly the way that certain men are charming, effortlessly, selectively, strategically. He had a job in something he described as consulting, which I've learned is a word that means different things depending on who's saying it. With him, I began to suspect it meant I find opportunities and I take them. They dated for 8 months before he proposed. She called me crying, happy crying, and I sat in my armchair and held the phone and said all the right things. "Congratulations, sweetheart. I can't wait to meet him properly. We'll celebrate this weekend." And I meant it. I genuinely tried to mean it. But I kept thinking about that first dinner, the questions about the parcel, the lake access comment in the driveway, and I thought about something my husband used to say. The first thing a person asks you tells you what they're really interested in. He had asked about the deed before he asked about dessert. I didn't say any of this to my girl. She was happy in a way I hadn't seen her since before her father got sick, and I wasn't going to take that from her based on a feeling. So I watched. I paid attention. I kept my mouth shut and my eyes open. The second red flag came 6 weeks later. My girl mentioned offhandedly that the fiancé had some questions about estate planning, specifically whether I had a will, whether the house and lake frontage were in my name alone, whether I'd ever considered putting assets into a joint trust. She framed it as thoughtfulness. "He wants to make sure you're protected, Mom. He says a lot of widows don't have their paperwork in order." I was washing dishes when she said this. I kept washing them. I didn't turn around. "That's very considerate of him," I said. "I'll have my attorney take a look at things." I called my attorney the next morning, not to update my will, to ask her what it would mean, legally, if I did put the house in a joint trust with my daughter before the wedding. She walked me through the implications. I took notes. I asked questions. And then I asked her something that had been sitting in the back of my mind for 2 weeks. If someone wanted to have me declared mentally incompetent, I said, How would they go about starting that process? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Has something happened?" I told her about the questions, about the estate, about consulting. She told me to document everything going forward, write down dates, conversations, anything unusual. She also told me to be careful about who had access to my medical records. I thought that last part was slightly dramatic, until the following week, when my doctor's receptionist called to confirm an appointment I hadn't made. Someone had called the office posing as a family member and asked about my general health. They hadn't gotten far because the receptionist followed protocol, but far enough to confirm my physician's name and whether I had any ongoing prescriptions. I sat down at my kitchen table when I got off that call. I sat there for a long time. I thought about my girl's face when she showed me the ring. The way her whole self lit up. I thought about how lonely she'd been the years after her father died. How she'd told me once that she didn't think she'd ever find someone who made her feel safe. And I thought about a man who smiled with all his teeth and asked about lake access before he asked my name. I called my attorney back and told her what had happened with the doctor's office. "Document it," she said, "and don't say anything to your daughter yet. Let's see what else surfaces." What surfaced next was harder to sit with. My girl came up for the weekend in early April, 8 weeks before the wedding, and she wasn't herself. Quieter than usual. She laughed at the right times, but her eyes were somewhere else. On Sunday morning, while we were having coffee on the back porch, I asked her if everything was all right. She said yes. Then she said, "The fiancé thinks we should look into moving the wedding day up." "Up?" I said. "It's already in June." "He thinks a spring wedding would be. He just thinks sooner is better." She looked at her coffee cup. "He also mentioned, again, the thing about the trust." "What did you tell him?" "I told him you'd think about it." She finally looked at me. "Mom, he's just trying to be practical. He loves me." A pause. "He loves us." I looked at my lake. The light was coming off the water in long, flat sheets. "I know you believe that," I said, "and I hope you're right." She left early that afternoon. I walked back inside and stood in my kitchen for a long time, and then I did something I hadn't done in years. I cried. Not because I was afraid exactly, because I was tired of being afraid quietly, and because I missed her father, and because I knew what I had to do, and I didn't want to be the one who had to do it. But I was, so I did. I hired a private investigator. My attorney recommended him. A former county sheriff's deputy, methodical, discreet. I gave him the fiancé's full name, his consulting company name, the city where my girl said he'd grown up. I told him I needed to know who I was dealing with. The report came back in 12 days. I made myself a cup of tea before I opened it. I sat at the kitchen table. I read slowly. The consulting company had been incorporated 18 months earlier. Before that, there was another company, dissolved after a civil suit filed by a woman in her late 60s, a widow, who alleged that a man matching his description had entered into a financial relationship with her and subsequently transferred significant assets into an LLC he controlled before disappearing. The suit was settled out of court. Her name was sealed. He had done this before, to someone exactly like me. I closed the folder. I drank my tea. And then I called my attorney and told her what was in the report. "We need to think about how to handle this," she said. "I know exactly how to handle it," I said. "I want to be clear about something because this is the part people always question. I chose not to go directly to the police. My attorney and I discussed it at length. The civil suit had been sealed, which meant it would take time to get anything actionable, and the activities I could document. The questions about the estate, the doctor's office inquiry were each individually explainable. What I needed was something undeniable, something that happened in front of witnesses. And I had a wedding to attend. I didn't tell my girl. This is a decision I've thought about most in the years since, and I'll tell you what I told myself at the time. She was in love, and she didn't believe me yet, and nothing I could say without proof was going to change that. I know how that sounds. but sometimes you have to trust the ending you can see even when the person you love can't see it yet. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, I put several things in motion. I had my attorney draft new documents clarifying the ownership structure of my property, everything clearly in my name, with explicit language about what could and could not be transferred without my written consent, and 2 independent witnesses. I had copies notarized and gave one to my sister and one to my attorney. I moved the original deed and investment documents to a lockbox at my bank. I also had a quiet conversation with the wedding venue coordinator, an old student of mine, as it happens, one of those small world coincidences that sometimes feel like grace. I told her I might need a few extra minutes at a specific moment during the reception, and I needed her to make sure the microphone was accessible. She didn't ask questions. She just nodded and wrote something in her planner. The morning of the wedding, my girl came to my room to have her hair done. Just the 2 of us, the way we planned since she was small. She sat in the chair in front of my vanity mirror, and I stood behind her and worked the curling iron through her hair, section by section, the way my mother had done for me. She was nervous and happy, and she talked about everything. The flowers, the menu, whether it was going to rain, and I listened to every word and said everything a mother says on her daughter's wedding day. At one point, she got quiet, and then she said, "I wish Dad could see this." I had to put down the curling iron. I pressed my hand to the top of her head, lightly, and I said, "He sees it. I promise you." She reached up and put her hand over mine. I almost didn't do what I had planned to do. I want to be honest about that. Standing there with my hand on her head and tears on both our faces, I thought, let it go. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he'll be different. And then I thought about the woman whose name was sealed in a court document, the widow, and I thought she probably had a daughter too. I finished her hair. She looked beautiful. She looked like the best version of every good thing. The ceremony was held in the garden. White chairs, the smell of early roses, the kind of late afternoon light that makes everything look softer than it is. I sat in the front row and watched my girl walk down the aisle, and I watched the fiancé watch her, and I looked for something real in his face, something that wasn't performance. I couldn't find it. The vows were spoken, and then, in the moment just before the officiant asked for rings, that brief pause that held breath, my girl reached into her bouquet. I thought she was adjusting the flowers. Then I saw her hand. She wasn't adjusting anything. She was pressing something small and folded against her palm. And as she turned toward me, as if to hand me the bouquet to hold, the way we'd planned, she looked at me with the most specific expression I have ever seen on another human face. It wasn't panic. It wasn't uncertainty. It was clarity, like something had finally clicked into place. The note said 4 words, "Mom, I believe you." I looked up at her. She gave the smallest nod. I stood up. What happened in the next 10 minutes is something I've replayed more times than I can count. I walked to the front. I asked the officiant, very calmly, very clearly, if I could have one moment before the rings. The way I said it left no room for argument. 31 years of working with 12-year-olds will do that to you. I turned to the guests, family on both sides, friends, faces I knew and faces I didn't, and I said that I had something to share that couldn't wait. And then I laid it out, methodically. The questions about the property, the inquiry at the doctor's office, the consulting company, the prior civil suit, the pattern from beginning to end. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't editorialize. I spoke the way I used to read to children, clearly, steadily, without skipping the hard parts. When I finished, there was a silence that seemed to have weight to it. The fiancé started to speak. He said something about slander, about misunderstanding, about how I'd always had a problem with him. He looked around for support and found none. His own family, his cousin and her husband who'd flown in from out of state, they were looking at him the way you look at someone you're seeing clearly for the first time. My attorney was there. She had been there all along, sitting 3 rows back on the bride's side, in a blue dress, a glass of water in front of her. She stood up. "The documentation has already been provided to the county sheriff," she said in her pleasant, measured way. "I'd suggest not leaving the property." 2 officers arrived 15 minutes later. They spoke with the fiancé privately first, then not so privately. He was not arrested that afternoon. These things take time, and I had understood that going in. But the investigation that followed moved faster than I expected, partly because the sealed civil suit was reopened when the other woman, whose name I still don't know, agreed to testify. My girl stood beside me the whole time. She held my hand so hard, my rings left marks on my fingers, and I would not have had it any other way. Later, much later, after the guests had gone and the flowers had been cleared and the venue was quiet and a little sad in the way that empty celebration spaces always are, we sat on the steps outside together. Just the two of us. A plate of untouched wedding cake between us. She hadn't eaten all day. "When did you know?" she asked me. "First dinner," I said, when he asked about the parcel. She was quiet for a moment. "I thought you were being protective. I thought it was just—" "I know," I said. "I thought I might be wrong too." "What made you keep going?" "I thought about the sealed court document, the widow whose name I didn't know." "Because being wrong was a luxury I couldn't afford," I said. "Not when it was you." She leaned her head against my shoulder. We stayed like that until the light was almost gone. The two of us on those steps, the plate of cake between us getting warm in the evening air. And I thought about what I would tell her when she was ready to hear it. Not that night, but someday. That love is not just what you feel. It's what you do with what you know. That a mother's instinct isn't paranoia. That sometimes the person who stands between you and harm is the one who loves you enough to let you be angry at them. I also thought about something else, something smaller and more ordinary. I thought about the lake behind my house, and the dock my husband built, and the mist in the early morning. And I thought about how, for the first time in months, I was going to be able to sit on that back porch and just watch the water without fear, without calculations, without that low-grade hum of vigilance that had been following me like weather. She never married him. She took a leave from her job, spent 2 weeks with me at the house, slept late and cooked badly and slowly came back to herself. By the end of summer she was laughing again, real laughter, not the kind that fills space. She's doing well now, better than well. She started seeing someone new. Someone who, on the very first evening he came to dinner, asked me about the garden, about what I grew and how long the season lasted and whether the soil near the lake was sandy or rich. He asked about the tomatoes before he asked about anything else. I refilled his glass and told him about the tomatoes. I still have that note. 4 words on a small piece of paper, folded twice, pressed into my palm at the edge of the most important moment of my daughter's life. I keep it in the drawer of my nightstand, under a book I've read so many times the spine has given out. I don't look at it often, but I know it's there. People have asked me, since everything came out, whether I feel vindicated. It's the wrong word. Vindication implies I was in a contest, and I was never trying to win anything. I was trying to protect someone I love from a man who had already practiced this on someone else, a woman whose name I still don't know, who sat across from a lawyer and signed her name on a settlement that sealed her silence, and who had no one sitting 3 rows back in a blue dress. That's the part that stays with me, not what he tried to do to me, but the fact that he'd done it before. Cause and effect runs in both directions, forward into consequences and backward into choices. He had made a choice, somewhere years earlier, to become the kind of man who sits at a widow's kitchen table and calculates the value of her grief. That choice had a logic to it, built from something, need, maybe, or resentment, or simple moral failure, and it kept compounding. Each time he got away with it, the next attempt became easier. Each woman who couldn't prove it made the next one more vulnerable. I stopped that chain. That's the only way I know how to think about it without getting too tangled up in my own feelings. What I've come to understand, living with this for a few years now, is that keeping my daughter safe required three things from me that didn't come easily and didn't come all at once. The first was honesty, not just with her, but with myself. I had to be willing to see what I was seeing without softening it. That's harder than it sounds. It's easier to tell yourself you're overreacting, that your instincts are clouded by loss or age or protectiveness. I had to look at what was in front of me and refuse to explain it away. That kind of moral clarity costs something. It means you can't go back to comfortable uncertainty once you've chosen to see clearly. The second was thinking carefully and slowly when everything in me wanted to act fast. Every instinct I had screamed to call my daughter the night I got the investigator's report and tell her everything. But I knew that without evidence, without the right moment, without something undeniable, she wasn't going to hear me. Not yet. I had to be smarter than my own fear. I had to plan and wait and trust that the right moment was coming. The third was showing up when it did, standing up in that garden in front of people I knew and people I didn't, and saying clearly what I had found. That required something I don't have a pretty word for. It wasn't courage exactly. It was more like deciding that my daughter's life mattered more than my discomfort. That's a decision, not a feeling. Feelings are unreliable. Decisions hold. She asked me once, that evening on the steps, if I'd been afraid. I told her yes. I'd been afraid from the first dinner to the last moment standing at that microphone. Fear doesn't go away just because you do the thing anyway. It just stops being the loudest voice in the room. My girl is well. The lake is still there. And every morning when I sit on that back porch and watch the light come off the water, I think about how much of what matters most in a life is invisible. The choices made quietly, the harms prevented before they happen, the love that shows up not as a feeling, but as something a person does, even when it costs them. That's all this was. Love, doing what it had to do.